So thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not really going to talk about spirituality. I'm talking about traditionalism as a critique of post-secular modernity. So the starting point is about 100 years ago, when a French esotericist by the name of René Guénon began the first of a series of books in which he developed a critique of modernity based in his reading of the Hindu scriptures. He concluded in The Crisis of the Modern World, published in 1927, that modernity was the Kali Yuga, that is to say, the era of the demon Kali. As described in the Puranas, a group of texts written mostly in Sanskrit at some point between 500 BC and 250 AD. In 1950, Génonom moved from Paris to Cairo, where he lived as a Sufi, known locally as Abdul Wahid Yahya, and he died in Egypt in 1951. Now, on the face of it, it seems unlikely that a century-old analysis of modernity by a French esotericist based in obscure Hindu myth would survive and flourish in today's very different climate. But this is what has happened. Guénon's work has given rise to an entire intellectual movement known as traditionalism, based partly on Guénon's analysis of modernity and partly on his understanding of perennial religion. This traditionalist movement includes the writings of many others, including most notably the Italian political theorist Julius Evola and the Swiss spiritual teacher Fridtjof Schuon. Its chief representatives today are Professor Syed Hussein Nasr in the United States, and I think you recognize Dr. Alexander Dugin in Russia. Those who are appreciative readers of Guénon and Evola, although not traditionalists in the sense that Nasr and Dugin are, include Steve Bannon, the former campaign manager and chief strategist of Donald Trump, Gabor Vona, the former president of the Hungarian political party Jobbik, which is a very successful party, and also Ernesto Araújo, who is the Brazilian foreign minister appointed by President Bolsonaro, who himself acknowledges the influence of Olavo de Carvalho, a former follower of Schuon, and recommends people to read Guénon. Another appreciative reader of Guénon in a slightly different category is Wael Halak, not a politician, but a respected university professor in the United States with a reputation built on his groundbreaking work on Islamic law. And he's just published a book last year, Revisiting Orientalism, that is in some ways a restatement of Guénon. Now, this paper doesn't allow me to describe or analyze the traditionalist movement as a whole, and this is available elsewhere, also in Russian translation, published by the NLO. What I'm going to do in this paper is instead to try to explain the continuing and perhaps surprising popularity of Guénon's critique of modernity. The leading French scholar of Guénon, Jean-Pierre Laurent, recently asked the same question in his preface to a book about Guénon's Hinduism. Why is it when those who are the intellectual inspiration of an entire generation are often subsequently forgotten, that Ghenon is still read. Especially, continues Laurent, when his understandings of Hinduism and of Islam were often defective. Laurent concludes that this is because his work asked fundamental questions that his work asked Western society's fundamental questions that have long been avoided and still remain unresolved. Halak came to the same conclusion. Ghenon's relevance, he thinks, issues from the urgency of the questions he sketched close to a century ago, questions that are preoccupying with renewed vigor modern academia and its subfields. Laurent doesn't say what he thinks these questions are, and Halak only suggests what they might be. He mentions post-colonial studies to environmental ethics. But Ghenon certainly questions much that is taken for granted, as this paper will show. I will also advance four further explanations of Ghenon's continuing appeal. One is that although Ghenon's critique was indeed founded on his reading of Hindu myth, the conclusions that he drew from it stand independently and connect to well-established themes in modern thought. Some of these themes are less current today than they were a century ago, but many remain current, giving contemporary relevance to Ghenon's work. Secondly, although these themes are also found elsewhere, only in Ghenon's traditionalism do they come together to form a unified theory. Thirdly, Ghenon's critique was so fundamental. Where others may question or excuse, he does not hesitate to condemn. This absolutism gives his work a certain majesty. Fourthly, Ghenon's argument has benefited from the growth of post-secularism. His critique is even more appealing today than it was 100 years ago, when secularism was at its peak. The Puranas divide human history into 4 eras or yugas. This is for the benefit of those who haven't read Ghenon. Of which the first is the Satya Yuga, or the era of truth, during which the gods ruled and perfect truth and justice prevailed on earth. This was succeeded by 2 further eras during which the gods slowly withdrew. And these eras were then succeeded by the era of the demonic Kali, the Kali Yuga. And during the Kali Yuga, the gods have withdrawn entirely, morality declines, and civilization degenerates. We are living in the Kali Yuga. Ghenon develops this idea in The Crisis of the Modern World. The crisis of the modern world, according to him, is due to the loss of sacred knowledge entirely on Hindu mythology, however. He concedes in The Crisis of the Modern World that in Hindu terms, the Kali Yuga includes almost the whole of recorded human history. And he explains that there were also smaller cycles within. He concedes that there are also smaller cycles within greater cycles. Ghenon then compared the Western civilization of his time with Greco-Roman civilization of the period preceding the collapse of the Greco-Roman world. This comparison didn't depend at all on Hindu mythology or on sacred knowledge, but rather on a well-established theme in human thought, also found in Oswald Spengler's Die Untergang des Abendlandes, a book published a little before the crisis of the modern world and very, very widely read at the time. The expectation of the collapse of Western civilization was widespread during the 1920s. Similar explanations are also found today, and Samuel Huntington's famous Clash of Civilizations is in some ways just a remake of Oswald Spengler's book. Genon's version of the Kali Yuga, then, in which the modern West is about to share the fate of Greco-Roman civilization, fits with more mainstream ideas. These analyses have more critics than supporters in Western academia, but they retain their force outside academia. Likewise, the argument that progress is an illusion does not either depend entirely on Hindu mythology or on sacred knowledge, and it also relates to a well-established theme in contemporary thought. It's often supposed that the belief in progress declined from a high point in the general optimism of the late 19th century as a result of the carnage of the First World War. But Geno himself noted in 1927 that belief in progress had become less widespread than it once was. Progress has continued to be questioned since then. Faith in progress is in fact a faith in a number of varieties of progress: moral and social progress, scholarly and scientific progress, and economic progress. All of these are now doubted. There's a widespread feeling that from a moral point of view, things have got worse rather than better. Similarly, the idea of social progress has lost much of its force with the slow fall of communism. The idea of scholarly progress is questioned nowadays by philosophers, and the desirability even of economic progress is now widely questioned under the headline of sustainability. So once again, we see that Genon's position fits with more mainstream analyses. After the first chapter of the crisis of the modern world, Genon moves on from the causes of the crisis of modernity to show that the conclusions of secular philosophy and various secular dogmas are wrong and are contributing to the crisis of modernity. His attack on secular dogmas really begins in chapter 4 on sacred knowledge and secular science. This attacks one of the chief supports of secularism, the growth of which during the 19th century was very much aided by the discoveries of natural science. Genon contrasts sacred knowledge, which proceeds from first principles, with secular natural science, which ignores first principles or even denies them, since the positivistic view that what cannot be observed can be ignored amounts to a denial. Methodological agnosticism for Genon is to glory, to glory in one's own ignorance. As a result, in Genon's view, modern natural science loses any deeper meaning. This is a more absolute argument than the more standard one, that the conclusions of natural science are wrong because they contradict the conclusions supported by faith. Rather, the conclusions of natural science are wrong because the method of natural science is inherently deficient. The perceived supremacy of natural science was near its height in 1927. Since then, the authority of natural science has declined, both in popular culture and in epistemology, so that once again, Genon is connecting with a major theme in contemporary thought. In popular culture, the claims of science, and especially of medical science, are received with ever more skepticism. And in epistemology, positivism has waned, repeatedly challenged from Thomas Kuhn to actor network theory. The fifth chapter, Individualism, is an attack on another of the chief dogmas of secularism, individual reason, which has been wrongly elevated to a position of supreme authority. This is a development that Geno identifies with Protestantism and free inquiry, glossed as interpretations left to the arbitrariness of everyone, even the ignorant and the incompetent. Again, Geno connects with a definite theme in contemporary thought, if not such a major one as on other occasions. Even if reason is not questioned in popular culture, it has become increasingly accepted in academia that reality is socially constructed. The sixth chapter, Social Chaos, is the book's most political chapter. The fifth chapter notes the negative consequences for legitimate authority, both spiritual and temporal, of reliance on individual reason. And the sixth chapter explores these consequences for temporal authority, explicitly attacking both the dogma of human equality and the principle and practice of democracy. Geno preferred hierarchy to equality, understanding the traditional hierarchy in terms of the nature of individual persons, with all the special abilities that it includes and which predispose each man to the fulfillment of this or that particular function. That's his understanding of hierarchy. The basis on which Geno condemned democracy was that power comes from below and rests essentially on the majority, which necessarily has the corollary of the exclusion of any real competence, because competence is always at least relative superiority, which can only be the preserve of a minority. Both equality and democracy were widely questioned during the 1920s and 1930s, with the political right rejecting equality and both the right and the left rejecting democracy. Since the collapse of the political systems of the 1920s and 30s, however, it's become less usual to question either equality or democracy, at least openly. Two subsidiary arguments made by Geno in this chapter remain popular today, however. While many who argue for equality and democracy truly believe in what they're arguing for, says Geno, these doctrines have been carefully nourished by those who have some interest in maintaining disorder, if not in aggregating it further. And in a time when it's claimed that everything may be discussed, they, equality and democracy, are the only things that one is never allowed to discuss. The first of these arguments fits well with the suspicion of self-serving elites that is one of the bases of the new politics, identified variously as populism or as neo-nationalism. And the second fits well with the reaction against so-called political correctness. Although Geno's frontal attack on equality and democracy may no longer match a widespread theme then, two of his subsidiary arguments do still match a widespread theme in modern thought. Finally, in chapter 7, Geno attacks a variety of other characteristics of modernity that he associates with the loss of sacred knowledge. The extent to which these points now match themes in contemporary thought varies. Two, especially, the elevation of economics into an end in itself and the creation of artificial needs are still sometimes regretted. Once again, then, Genon's subsidiary conclusions connect to well-established themes. Finally, Genon's attack on secularism is even more appealing in today's post-secular world than it was 100 years ago, as part of the phenomenon identified by the French Islamologist Gilles Kepel as the revenge of God. During the 1970s, in Kepel's view, long-established trends towards the secularization of society and politics went into reverse, and a new religious approach took shape aimed at recovering sacred foundations for the organization of society. If Kepel is right that contemporary modernity is showing a widespread enthusiasm for recovering sacred foundations for the organization of society, Genon should be benefiting from this, as to recover a sacred foundation for the organization of society was actually the main objective of his entire work. It was the central argument of the second chapter of his Crisis of the Modern World, and he returns to it again in the 9th chapter of this book. Kepel, however, may not be right in dating the revenge of God to the 1970s. That was perhaps when the revenge of God became most visible, but that revenge may also have been based in part on a much older longing for God. The whole of the Romantic movement can be understood as a search for the transcendent. Isaiah Berlin famously identified the Romantic movement as, quote, an open declaration of war, unquote, on the Enlightenment, and recognized that this was sometimes based in a search for the transcendent. That Berlin limited it in this way was perhaps because he didn't look far enough into the Romantic movement because of its general hostility to Christianity, which he might have understood as a hostility to religion as a whole. So, by way of conclusion, those who are today inspired by Genon's critique of modernity are not primarily expressing agreement with the chronology of the Puranas. Rather, they're expressing suspicion of apparently self-serving elites and the alleged tyranny of political correctness. They may also be questioning the autonomy of human reason and contesting the hegemony of natural science. They may also be concerned about the decline of Western civilization and unconvinced by narratives of progress. All these issues are discussed in Genon's Crisis of the Modern World, and all of these issues remain as topical today as they were a century ago. These ideas are not the exclusive property of the traditionalists. Traditionalism, then, almost uniquely, so that part of traditionalism is quite standard, but what traditionalism does almost uniquely is bring together all these different critiques into a single unified theory. And this unified theory, which refers to the transcendent and to the loss of the transcendent, is even more attractive today in a post-secular age than it was 100 years ago. So that's it.
So, questions? Okay.
First of all, thank you for your book, Against the Modern World. I read it with interest. I have 3 questions. How many can I ask?
It depends on the length of your questions.
Okay, I will start for the first. When I read Ghenon, I read several books, but I didn't do it with some kind of system and so on. So I want to ask, because this question is interesting for me, for myself very much. The question is from where Ghenon took his concept of integral traditionalism. I mean that in Islam there is the same conception of Islam, that there is the Tawheed, that is some kind of inner tradition, and it's not just the tradition of Muhammad, but also the tradition of all the divine tradition. And the same concept Ghenon had, did he took it from Islam, or he took it from his period of Hinduism and so on? Thank you.
That's only one question. Okay, you want to ask one after the other? Fine, all right, yeah. Now, so yes, I mean, the idea is there in Islam, and it's there in the concept of the Din al-Fitra, the original religion. I think you can find similar ideas in many religious systems, because all religions have the problem of explaining their place in human history. So all religions like to trace themselves back to the beginning of humanity. But I think especially he takes the idea of the perennial philosophy from a stream in Western thought that in the book that you kindly referred to, I trace back to the Renaissance, but which I've since realized goes back even further. It goes back to St. Augustine, it goes back to some of the Romans and some of the Greeks even. And the idea of a succession of basically similar communications from the divine to humanity is found all over the place. So that's not an idea I particularly emphasized in my talk today, but once again, this is an idea which is quite widespread, found quite widely.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, you said about Spengler and so on, and my question will be, there was some kind of school of political philosophy in pre-Nazi German that called a School of Conservative Revolution. Yeah. And what was the influence of Ghenon and his traditionalism school to these philosophers? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, the conservative revolution is a later concept, so they didn't sort of sit around together and say we are forming the conservative revolution. The term was introduced, I think, in the 1950s by a later history of that movement. I don't think that Ghenon had particular influence on that movement. Evola was in touch with that movement, so through Evola one has a connection between Ghenon and the conservative revolution. They were very much in sympathy with each other on a number of points, which I think illustrates the fact that they were coming out of a common intellectual environment, and also that they were responding to similar conditions, to similar crises of essentially the First World War and the new world that came into being after the First War, which all of them are addressing in similar ways. And for the third question?
No,
No?
perhaps
No.
we'll
Okay.
give the
Afterwards.
Mark, thank you very much for the presentation and the really great book which Irina's publishing house published recently. I wanted to ask you about more of you talked about his kind of a political philosophy, fine.
Yeah.
Can we move a little bit to this subject, which was very interesting for people like Jamal and Dugin and I think Kuryokin and Letov, all these guys in the Russian public domain. I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, Ghenon managed to show that there is an underlying tradition which manifested itself in Christianity, in Islam, etc. He talked about north and other geographical access or certain special places on the map of the world. I remember that from reading him like 5 years ago. Can you cover a little bit of that? Because I think that is what also attracted a lot of big people to his works. Kind of this unique blend explaining everything, that there is underlying tradition, and then it pops up in different cultures in a different way. Thank you.
No, I think you're right. I mean, the fact that he presents a total system is important, because total systems are always can be very appealing to I don't know, to some people, or to perhaps to the human mentality. To what extent he shows that there really is this underlying tradition that you can find in different religious traditions can be disputed, because he starts off, methodologically, he starts off with a fairly clear idea of what this underlying system is, and then proceeds to find this underlying system in all the different religious traditions. So methodologically, he's not exactly testing a hypothesis. He's setting out to prove a hypothesis. And as I mentioned, Jean-Pierre Laurent in this book about his use of Hinduism, contemporary experts in Hinduism, for example, are often not totally happy with his understanding of Hinduism. And I'm not an expert in Hinduism, but his understanding of Islam, which isn't so central to his work, you can certainly question it. So I think that really we are probably seeing a reformulation of the old idea of the perennial philosophy, then being supported in various different ways, rather than the other way around.
Thank you very much for your very interesting paper, and I think that those rhymes of Genon's theory with the modern age is shown you very convincingly, but I have just a small question. I know that Steve Bannon was, he admitted it himself, was influenced by traditionalism, and what do you think, to what extent he was really familiar with Genon's works? Was he aware of the fact that Genon was a Muslim? Well, and how deeply he, was involved in all this stuff? Thank you.
I haven't myself had the opportunity to interview Bannon, but I've been in contact with Josh Green, who wrote this book about Bannon and who did interview him several times. He started off before he became famous and retained access even after he'd moved into the White House. And all that we know for certain on this is that he told Green that when he'd been a young naval officer, he'd read Geno and it had changed his life. At which point, Green gets on the internet, tries to find out who this guy Geno was, and telephones me. So we don't really know in the case of Bannon, but we do know a bit more in the case of the three people who I just showed there. And a picture, after I'd done the PowerPoint, there was this lovely picture of a dinner held at the Brazilian embassy in Washington, D.C., where we had the President Bolsonaro had Bannon on his left, and on his right he had Olavo de Carvalho, and next to Olavo de Carvalho was Arajal, the foreign minister. Now, I mean, the one I know most about is Olavo de Carvalho, and Olavo de Carvalho was a sort of Brazilian Dugin, really, because he started off in a very alternative milieu. He ran a school for astrology. He translated one of Genon's books into Portuguese. He joined the Mariameia, and then he decided that the Mariameia was part of a world conspiracy to Islamize everything, and left them. And he now has the same position on Islam that Bannon has. So we have a, yeah. I mean, these people cannot just be interpreted as traditionalists, because there are many other things. And you know, today we can find one or two sort of pure traditionalists sitting in an attic somewhere in Italy or something like that. But that isn't the significance of Ghenon traditionalism today. The significance of Ghenon traditionalism today is that there are all sorts of people who are taking these ideas and putting them together with a few other ideas to produce a synthesis which is suitable for the 21st century.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay,
Yeah,
the third one.
third
Yes,
question.
the last.
My question will be about the influence of Ghenon today, and how people. You told us about these politicians, how they describe Ghenon as their spiritual teacher, or maybe as the critique of the modern world. And I know that there are several Sufi tariqas in modern West, for example in Italy, and also the tariqa of Shuon, that is under the Ghenon influence. So how is it with the West now? Thank you.
What the spiritual side spiritual, thank you. The spiritual side as opposed to the political side, you mean? You're asking how the religious, spiritual, Sufi side of traditionalism. Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends a bit what you mean by the West, because you know the West goes in circles. There's the sort of central West, and then there's places like Hungary and Brazil, which are sort of in the West. I think in the sort of central West, his influence is through occasional people who are part of the new politics. So it's largely a political influence. In the more peripheral West, I think he has a somewhat broader intellectual influence. The sort of spiritual religious influence is shifting, I think, because at one point it was an influence on the West, and Sufi tariqas that you mentioned, like Shuon's, for example. And I think that influence seems to be declining now. And the larger religious influence, I think, is now in countries like Iran, Turkey, and to some extent Morocco as well. Because it's in countries like that where people are looking for a religious response to modernity. And in some ways, the Islamism of the Muslim Brothers and so forth in the 1930s and 1940s, that was a religious response to modernity. But it's lost its appeal today. In the 30s and 40s, it was very much avant-garde intellectually, whereas today it's become very institutionalized in some ways, and I don't think it excites the very intellectual people in the Muslim world any longer. So there are people who are looking for an alternative there, an alternative way of understanding modernity, and that's one place where Geno and later traditions, especially people like Said Hussein Nasser, and then in the Morocco and the Francophone world, there are people like Fawzi Sqali, who are widely read in certain intellectual milieu. Yeah, I think they're probably more interested in the analysis of modernity. You could indeed say that. You could indeed say that. But I think they'd probably respond that they were more interested in the analysis of modernity.
Mark, can you hear me? I just wondered if I could pull you a little bit in the direction of what Boaz was talking about by taking up on the last point and noting, for example, that in the West, at least, whether the central or the peripheral West, there are lots of people who belong to Sufi organizations who explicitly don't think of themselves as Muslims. I can tell you that the majority of Australian white Sufis are not Muslims, they're just Sufis. And so we get this idea of a kind of transnational Sufism that does link back to tradition and is also a mystical path that offers spirituality, etc., but is kind of separate from religion, so it occupies that sort of middle space that Boaz was talking about?
There, I think actually there are two links. I mean, one of them, I was looking in this direction when I mentioned the Romantic movement. So the question about the connection between the Romantic movement and spirituality that was asked of Boaz, I thought provided a nice link with what I was talking about. These universalist Sufis who you find in Australia are generally members of the Sufi movement started by Inayat Khan. And the Sufi movement that was started by Inayat Khan was very much assisted in its early years by former members of the Theosophical Society. So the connection here goes like so many things so often, goes into the Theosophical Society, because the idea of perennialism, which was so important to Geno, can also, in his case, be traced back to the Theosophical Society, and in the case of your universalist Sufis, who you find in many places as well, can also be traced back to the perennialism of the Theosophical Society. So when there was a discussion about the New Age, one of the questions that one can ask is, how new is the New Age? I mean, the New Age itself as an epoch, as a period, you know, you can sort of trace it from 1960 something or other, and then the interesting question is, when did that period end? And some people think it has, and some people think it hasn't. But the ideas of the New Age were often very, very old ideas. And one of my favorite characters from the New Age is a guy called Samuel Lewis, otherwise known as Sufi Sam. And he grew a large beard, and on one occasion landed at San Francisco airport, and he heard somebody looked, and he was met by some of his disciples, and somebody looked at him and said, "Who's that?" And he heard this and replied, "It is the New Age in person." And what he said in his diary, I think it was, he said that we are indeed entering a new age, and this is an age in which suddenly things that I've been interested in throughout my life, and which nobody else was interested in, suddenly everybody is interested in them. So a lot of the ideas which became very popular in the New Age are in fact very old ideas. They can be very easily traced back to the 19th century in the Theosophical Society, and then they can also be traced back from there, in many cases, back to the Renaissance or Neoplatonism or Socrates himself. I don't know. So there is a very definite connection there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like to end with a humorous remark. It's interesting. I think you mentioned in your book that in the Soviet era, in spite of all this pseudo-Marxist progressive discourse, the rhetorics of traditionalism concerning the criticism of the West was absolutely the same. So this stagnation of the West and losing its spirituality, and this word was used by the communist propagandist, and so and the poor population who had been suffering for all kinds of shortages created kind of joke. And they say, yes, the West is stagnating, but its smell is delicious. Thank you so much.